The time has finally come, the time for the big one. AMD's best versus Intel's best. The Ryzen 7 9800X3D versus the mighty Core i9 14900K. Two powerful gaming CPUs in a 45-game head-to-head. Now, the 9800X3D did snatch the performance crown based on our day one review data, covering just 14 games. So now it is time to see how they stack up across a massive range of games. But before we do, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their CryoSheet graphene thermal pads, which are an excellent alternative to thermal pastes. They offer very high thermal conductivity with no liquid components, so they can't dry out and therefore don't degrade over time like pastes and even liquid metals. CryoSheet is very easy to use, it's extremely durable, and is available in a range of sizes to suit most applications. I've personally done some high-end GPU testing with CryoSheet, and the results were impressive, very similar in fact to that of liquid metal, but without the mess, and of course, no risk of drying out. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. I also recently compared the 9800X3D with the Core Ultra 9 285K, and it was a brutal matchup for Intel when looking purely at gaming performance. The 9800X3D ended up delivering 24% greater gaming performance on average across the 45 games tested, with no real examples where the Ryzen processor was slower, beyond the margin of error. So the 14900K will surely fare better, as it does remain Intel's most powerful gaming processor, but even so, this could still end up being a bit of a rough matchup. Now, for testing, all CPU gaming benchmarks will be conducted at 1080p using a GeForce RTX 4090, and if you'd like to learn why this is actually the best way to evaluate CPU performance for games today and in the future, I have a few videos linked in the description that you can go check out to learn more. Now, the 14900K has been tested using the Extreme profile with DDR5 7200 memory, while the 9800X3D, it's also been tested in a stock condition, but with DDR5 6000 memory. Okay, let's get into the graphs. For our first batch of games, let's start from the top with The Last of Us Part 1, where the 9800X3D is 24% faster on average, or 30% faster when comparing 1% lows. So it is a big performance uplift in this example, and while you might not need well over 140 FPS to enjoy The Last of Us Part 1, these results suggest that in future, more demanding games, the 9800X3D will be a good bit faster. And it's a similar story with Cyberpunk. You might not need more performance than what the 14900K is actually offering here, but the fact that the 9800X3D was on average 33% faster is incredible. Now, a title where high refresh rate gamers will appreciate what the 9800X3D has to offer is Hogwarts Legacy. Here, the Ryzen processor was a staggering 37% faster, averaging 170 FPS, opposed to 124 FPS with 1% lows of just 86 FPS. ACC is almost a different game entirely with the 9800X3D, allowing for 269 FPS to be rendered, making it an unbelievable 61% faster than the 14900K. Then we have Spider-Man Remastered with our closest margin yet, at just 23% in favour of the AMD processor, which is obviously still an incredibly big margin. Moving on, we have Baldur's Gate 3, and here the 9800X3D is 27% faster than the 14900K, throughputting 176 FPS on average with 1% lows of 122 FPS. And then we have the gains in Homeworld 3, which frankly are hard to believe. Here the Ryzen 7 processor was able to boost the average frame rate by 52%, resulting in a very noticeable performance uplift. And this is mostly due to the fact that the 1% lows were improved by 110%. We're also looking at a 31% performance advantage favouring the 9800X3D and a Plague Tale Requiem, jumping up from 149 FPS on average to 195 FPS. There's also up to a 30% performance improvement seen in Microsoft Flight Simulator, though the 1% lows were similar here. Then we have Starfield, where the average frame rate only saw an 11% increase, but the 1% lows were boosted by 22%. Moving on to our next batch of results, we'll start with Horizon Forbidden West, and in this example, the 9800X3D is just 11% faster, which historically would have been a very large margin to see between AMD and Intel flagship processors. But with the 9800X3D, it's almost more of a minimum. Anyway, we're also seeing a 16% margin in Horizon Zero Dawn. Now, interestingly, despite being an older game, we're still seeing some pretty huge gains for the 9800X3D in Watch Dogs Legion, where the average frame rate was boosted by 29% and the 1% lows by a massive 50%. The margins are reined back in a bit with Far Cry 6, where the X3D CPU was just 13% faster, and then we have Throne and Liberty, where the 14900K somehow ends up coming out on top, albeit by margin of error with a mere 2% advantage. Now, for our next set of results, we'll start with another old game, Hitman 3, which to this day is still very CPU demanding, though not nearly as CPU limited as many of the more modern titles are, given frame rates that can exceed well over 200 FPS. But what's interesting here is that the 14900K and 9800X3D are quite evenly matched, with the Ryzen 7 processor winning by a mere 5% margin. Then we have the Callisto Protocol, where the 3D V-Cache processor was 24% faster on average, and despite that, the 1% lows were pretty similar between these two processors. Now, whereas performance was similar in Hitman 3, that is not the case for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where the 9800X3D is a massive 28% faster on average, or 47% faster when comparing 1% lows. Then we have Halo Infinite, and this one doesn't seem to play as well as you might expect on the 9800X3D, at least relative to the 14900K, given the Intel CPU is actually 6% faster, though the 1% lows were higher for the Ryzen 7 processor. Then we have Warhammer 3, where the performance was much the same. The 14900K was 2% faster, so as I said, overall much the same here. For our next set of results, we'll start with Black Ops 6, and here the 9800X3D is offering 19% greater performance with a massive 27% boost to the 1% lows. And then we're looking at a 16% performance advantage for the Ryzen 7 processor in Borderlands 3, so a pretty noteworthy uptick there. We're also seeing a 24% performance advantage in the Riftbreaker, which is still a huge margin really, but not something we'd typically expect to see when comparing flagship processors. We're also looking at a 32% performance uplift in Remnant 2 and 37% in Star Wars Jedi Survivor. For those looking for more FPS in War Thunder, the 9800X3D certainly has you covered, pumping out 397 FPS in the CPU benchmark, making it 21% faster than the 14900K. Unfortunately though, Skull and Bones, Returnal and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart all appear quite heavily GPU limited, so no real performance differences here between these two CPUs, at least in those examples. Then we have Dying Light 2, where the Ryzen 7 processor was 11% faster, so a reasonable margin there. As usual, the Forza games are GPU limited, as they use very little of the CPU, and as a result both processors delivered the same level of performance. That wasn't the case though in Gears 5, where the 9800X3D was 41% faster or 62% faster when comparing 1% lows. And then we see a more mild 11% performance advantage favouring the Ryzen 7 processor in Ghost of Tsushima, while there was no real difference in Hunt Showdown. Now for the next set of games we have World War Z, where the 9800X3D is offering 20% greater performance, F124, where it was 13% faster, Rainbow Six Siege, that saw an 18% increase, 29% in Counter-Strike 2, and 28% in Fortnite. So big gains across the board here for the Ryzen 7 processor. Finally, we have the last 5 games tested, and we'll start with Assassin's Creed Mirage, which saw the 9800X3D delivering 15% greater performance, which is quite a bit more than what we saw in Valhalla, where the margin was reduced to just 3%. Now, a game that is heavily CPU limited to the point that any performance increase will be noticeable is Space Marine 2, and here the 9800X3D was 23% faster than the 14900K, allowing for 138 FPS to be rendered on average. Star Wars Outlaws, though, is limited to just over 140 FPS in our test scene, and it's unclear what the limitation is here, though it does seem as though it could be the game itself. And then finally we have Dragon Age The Vanguard, and in this example the 9800X3D was 11% faster. Okay, so here it is, the 45 game comparison. And on average, we found that the 9800X3D is 18% faster than the 14900K, which is quite a bit less than the 27% margin we found in our day one review. But that data excluded a lot of the GPU limited scenarios, such as those seen in the Forza games for example. Still, even so, there was just a single example where the 9800X3D was slower by a 5% margin, and that was seen in Halo Infinite. There were also just 11 of the 45 games tested where the Ryzen 7 processor was just 5% faster or less, meaning in the vast majority of the games tested, we're looking at double-digit margins favoring the Ryzen processor, with over 20 examples where the margin exceeded 20%. So it's fair to say that the 9800X3D is generally much faster than the 14900K for gaming. Now, when looking at the 1% lows, we see a similar margin overall. This time, the 9800X3D was 22% faster on average, and pushing up that average was the insane uplift seen in Homeworld 3, where the 9800X3D was 110% faster. There are also no real examples where the Ryzen 7 processor was slower when looking at 1% lows. Obviously, if you're after the very best gaming performance you can get, the Ryzen 7 9800X3D is the CPU to get, and the 14900K really should no longer even be considered. You could argue this was already the case with the 7800X3D, but at least those two parts traded blows fairly regularly, but with the 9800X3D, it's now very much a one-sided battle. There's also that major issue of power consumption with the Core i9 processor, and although I didn't look at power usage in this video, nothing has changed here, and this is really well documented at this point in time. The 14900K just consumes a lot more power to often deliver a lot less performance. Really, in my opinion, the only problem with the 9800X3D at present is availability. Getting your hands on one has been a little bit tricky ever since release. I've managed to buy a few of them here in Australia at the recommended retail price, but as I put this video together, they're currently sold out everywhere and they're back on pre-order. So with demand as high as it is, retailers are having a bit of a tough time keeping them in stock. Of course though, availability will improve, so this is more of a short-term issue, and should you be able to buy one at the $480 US MSRP, which you will be able to do shortly, I think at that price it's a good deal. Certainly when parts like the 14900K still cost $450 US. The 7800X3D also appears to be done now with virtually no availability for over a month. So when it comes to the 9800X3D's gaming performance, there isn't much more to explore here. It's worlds faster than the 285K and much faster than the 14900K. If you're already using a 7800X3D or a 14900K, then this upgrade isn't really worth it. At least it won't be for the vast majority of you. Though the 9800X3D really only makes sense for those who require the absolute best performance anyway. And truth be told, much cheaper processors such as the Ryzen 7 7700 will generally suffice for modern gaming. And that is going to do it for this head-to-head comparison. If you enjoyed it, thumbs up, I guess, the YouTube like button thing. Subscribe if you want. Also, we have the join button if you want to become a Harbour Unbox member. That'll give you access to our exclusive Discord server. We also have monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, Q&As. There's also a Patreon account which does the same sort of thing, so check those out if you're interested. If not, perfectly fine, and I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.